There's something very modern about the way driving rules now arrive in people's lives, not through official announcements most people actively seek out, but through fragments, a headline on Facebook, a warning shared in a family WhatsApp group, a YouTube thumbnail with bold red text about huge fines and new rules starting tomorrow. And suddenly, ordinary drivers across the UK find themselves wondering whether they've missed something important. And honestly, that feeling alone says quite a lot about the relationship people now have with authority, regulation, and everyday life. Because when it comes to parking rules, most drivers already feel slightly uncertain, not reckless, not irresponsible, just uncertain. The signs are complicated, councils differ from one area to another. Private parking companies operate under different systems entirely, and the fines themselves seem to increase quietly in the background year after year. So when stories begin circulating about 10 new parking rules or warnings linked to the DVLA, people pay attention. Even if the details are sometimes exaggerated, the anxiety underneath them is real. What's interesting is that many of the changes being discussed aren't necessarily brand new laws appearing overnight. They're often part of a wider tightening of enforcement that has been building gradually across the UK for years. More cameras, more digital monitoring, more automated penalty systems, more restrictions designed around congestion, accessibility, cycling infrastructure, and pedestrian safety. And I think people can feel that shift happening even if they don't always know the legal specifics. Parking, strangely enough, has become one of the clearest examples of how modern Britain manages public space, because every pavement, dropped curb, loading zone, bus lane, and residential street now carries competing demands. Residents want quieter roads, councils want smoother traffic flow, cyclists want safer lanes, disabled pedestrians need unobstructed access, businesses want customer parking, drivers want practicality. And somewhere in the middle of all that sits the ordinary motorist, often just trying to park without accidentally triggering a £100 penalty notice. The thing people are starting to notice is that enforcement no longer feels occasional. It feels constant. Cameras don't get tired, and systems don't miss details. Digital records don't forget timestamps. In some towns and cities, drivers describe a feeling that parking has become less about convenience and more about precision. You stop slightly over a line, you pause near a dropped curb, you misread a time restriction by 20 minutes, and suddenly there's a fine attached to your registration number before you've fully realized a mistake was made. Now, to be fair, there's another side to this conversation that matters just as much. Many of these stricter rules exist because genuine problems have grown impossible to ignore. Pavement parking blocks wheelchair users and parents with proms. Cars left near junctions create visibility hazards. Cycle lane obstructions increase risk. For cyclists, emergency access routes matter. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Most regulations don't appear out of nowhere. They emerge because enough people complained about something repeatedly until councils and authorities responded. But it's strange, because even when people agree with the reasoning behind enforcement, they often still resent the experience of it. That emotional contradiction is everywhere now. Drivers may support safer roads in theory while simultaneously feeling targeted in practice. And honestly, the language around fines doesn't help. Penalty, enforcement, contravention. The terminology itself feels cold and procedural, even when the original mistake was relatively human. A rushed school run, confusing signage, a delivery stop that lasted longer than expected. The conversation seems to be shifting toward something bigger than parking itself, toward the broader feeling that modern life increasingly operates through systems of automated correction. Cameras identify, databases process, letters arrive, appeals become digital forms. There's less room now for informal discretion. I keep coming back to how emotionally disproportionate parking fines can feel compared to the offense itself, not legally, emotionally, because the fine is rarely just the amount printed on paper. It arrives attached to stress, irritation, embarrassment, and sometimes financial pressure. For some households, especially during a cost of living crisis, a £70 or £100 fine isn't a mild inconvenience. It disrupts the week, it changes spending decisions, it becomes part of a wider pressure people are already carrying. And maybe that's why these stories spread so quickly online. They tap into an existing sense that everyday life is becoming more regulated, more monitored, and more expensive all at once. What's also happening is a blurring between official enforcement and misinformation. The DSA has already warned drivers about fake parking fine text scams pretending to be official notices, and that creates another layer of uncertainty because people now receive so many messages, alerts, and payment requests that even legitimate communication can feel suspicious. You can almost feel public trust becoming fragmented. Drivers are told to stay informed, but the information environment itself often feels chaotic. Real rule changes sit beside exaggerated headlines and misleading social media clips. Some videos imply dramatic overnight legal transformations that simply are not happening in the way they're presented. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, there usually is a grain of truth. Councils are increasing enforcement powers in certain areas. Pavement parking scrutiny is expanding. Obstruction penalties are becoming more serious in some parts of England. So people are responding not just to headlines but to a genuine sense that the margin for error is shrinking. There's also a generational element to this conversation that rarely gets discussed openly. Older drivers often talk about how driving used to feel simpler, fewer restrictions, less surveillance, more informal understanding between motorists and local communities. Younger drivers, meanwhile, have grown up in a system where cameras, permits, apps, congestion zones, and automated penalties are normal parts of driving culture. To them, regulation feels built into the experience from the beginning. Neither perspective is entirely wrong, they're simply reflections of different eras. And I think that's partly why these parking debates become emotionally charged so quickly. They're not only about where a vehicle stops, they're about changing expectations around public behavior, personal freedom, and urban life itself. Cities especially are evolving around competing priorities: cleaner air targets, reduced congestion, active travel policies, expanded pedestrian areas, electrification, public transport incentives. Parking restrictions become one mechanism within a much larger redesign of how movement works in modern Britain. And honestly, drivers can sense that transition even when politicians describe it in softer language. Some people see these changes as necessary adaptation. Others see them as a slow narrowing of flexibility for ordinary motorists. Most people probably sit somewhere between those two positions, accepting parts of the argument while resisting others. What's interesting is how parking has become symbolic far beyond its practical function. A parking fine is never just about parking anymore. It represents bureaucracy, authority, financial strain, urban pressure, and technological oversight all condensed into one envelope or notification. And then there's the human behavior behind it all. Because despite the frustration, most drivers don't intentionally break rules. They misjudge, they rush, they assume, they interpret unclear signs differently. Human beings operate imperfectly, while enforcement systems increasingly operate with machine-level precision. That gap matters, especially as technology advances further. More AI-assisted traffic monitoring, more camera enforcement, more digital permits linked directly to registrations, more automated fine processing. The future of driving enforcement is almost certainly becoming less human, not more, and maybe that's the point people are reacting to instinctively, even if they struggle to articulate it clearly. Because once systems become fully automated, nuance becomes harder to feel. The machine records a violation, the notice is generated, the process begins. Whether the context felt understandable or accidental becomes secondary to whether the system detected a breach. And honestly, that can create a quiet emotional fatigue in public life, a feeling that everyday activities require constant vigilance. Still, there's an important balance here that deserves recognition. Safer roads matter, accessible pavements matter, clearer traffic systems matter. Most people genuinely do want fair rules that protect vulnerable road users. The real debate is often about proportionality, communication, and trust. Do people feel informed properly? Do they feel rules are applied reasonably? Do they feel enforcement exists primarily for safety or revenue generation? Those perceptions shape public reaction just as much as the regulations themselves. And maybe that's why stories like this resonate so deeply, because they're never just about 10 parking rules or huge fines. They reflect a wider societal mood, a sense that ordinary life is becoming increasingly managed through systems people don't fully control but are expected to navigate perfectly. And I think that lingering discomfort is what keeps these conversations alive long after the headlines disappear.